All right, Dr. Kari Thyne, Dr. John Edgar Caterson, JE, you go by with your friends. Hopefully, I can call you that over the course of our conversation. I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. We are talking about suicides in the military. The annual report on suicides just came out. 2023 slightly higher than 2022, but the active duty numbers have shown an increase for the last decade or so. Dr. Caterson, if you could, why do you think those numbers, despite the efforts to counteract this, why do you think there's been a steady increase in active duty suicides over the last decade?
I think it's, kind of like compound interest, with all the things that the military has been through in the 20-year, GWAT, Global War on Terrorism. And even as we've kind of ramped down on that, just like anything else that would that impacts us in the area of our mental, our emotional, our spiritual health, it catches up with us. And I think that the traditional approaches that we've used to combat military suicide has not had the impact that we were hoping that would have.
By traditional approaches, I mean, are we talking about the videos, like the unguided trainings that people are required to take that aren't necessarily having the impact that we want?
Well, first of all the dynamics that come in with suicide, military suicide. There's a stigma about even getting help. And if you go to get help, even in your next life after the military, there is this reticence or this hesitation that this is gonna follow me, to get a job. That it's gonna go on my record and all that kind of stuff. And so, I know that there's been great efforts, like pathways to assisting living, the PAL model of dealing with suicide, which is basically how do you help them connect with the suicide ideation that they have, or getting a better understanding of actually their story and what are the things that they've experienced that actually are going to take them to at least that they're going to engage it, understanding the choices that they have. And then what does it look like when you put into place everything that like assist would have, where there is a safe plan, actions that can be taken. How do you help them to develop next steps and safe systems and stuff like that? So in turn, in the military, at least in the last 5 or 6 years, there has been a move towards a long game of saying, okay, how do we look at military suicide in the area of suicide prevention? And there's a lot of work that's being done with that right now. Then how do you deal with suicide intervention, suicide postvention, which is being responsible, and how do you manage the aftermath of a suicide event? And a suicide event is not necessarily just military suicide, but what about the ideation and all the stuff that goes along with it? And I think also part of it is for those that are trying to care for the soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, guardian that has ideation, has a suicide attempt, or has committed suicide. How do you provide even compassion fatigue for the caregiver? So they all kind of work together. And I think that so there has been great advances. And then there's also the stuff that Dr. Thyne and I have been working on over the last 4 or 5 years is this not tied to a bigger continuum? So as you're looking at the fact that within within the military, the decisions that they are faced with making in their call of duty are a lot greater of a burden that it impacts not just their character internally, but also kind of like their moral dispensation, or it causes like a moral dilemma for them. And that gets tied also to things like moral drift that move into moral injury. And what we have found, especially in our area, in special operation forces, but also greater military as well, the connection between moral injury being a precursor to suicide ideation, especially in the special operation forces world. But we do see that in larger military as well. Matter of fact, all the components and all the branches of the military have stood up moral injury task force to look at this connection. We sit on a number of those, but let's take the Air Force for just a moment, not just because Dr. Thyne was a retired Air Force officer and had command and dealt with this, but just even more recently, we see the fact that the Air Force sees moral injury as something that someone has to take ownership and leadership to. So it's really a combination of the military chaplain corps, but also working hand in hand with the psychologists, and cognitions. They're saying, how can we get our head wrapped around this?
You bet. Dr. Thyne, I want to bring you in here real quick. I saw you nodding along in agreement with a lot of what Dr. Caterson was saying. So when we're talking about moral injury, and obviously the both of you work in the special operations community, but it's not, as your time in the Air Force has shown, it's not just necessarily special operators dealing with moral injury. It could be anybody from any service. What are some cases of moral injury that you've seen that have impacted a soldier's mental disposition? And I'm not necessarily like saying, give me specifics, but like in general, what are some cases of some moral injury that might have occurred that aren't necessarily special operator, I had to kill this person to get through a door kind of thing, but just more general, wider scale things?
Sure. In fact, we just talked about it, and I'm actually briefing Dr. Caterson's work, so he'll jump in if I get it wrong. But what the research is showing is that moral injury can be caused by a variety of things. Like you've said, witnessing things. It's not just in the doing of things. It's witnessing others violate their moral values, beliefs, and principles. So the number one cause of moral injury is actually witnessing the moral failure of leaders. So that when we're out and about and talking to people, that's what they are reporting. So there is a misstep or a mismatch between what people are expecting to see from their leaders and what they are seeing from their leaders. And part of our education lesson is to try and to let leaders know they know, but to remind them that they are constantly being watched for what they do and for what they don't do by everyone around them, whether they realize it or not. And their actions can be very impactful to those around, particularly when they're failing to meet or actually violating on purpose a moral code.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think Dr. Thyne is spot on that. That we coming back to the continuum that we've been training on and even educating the force on is the fact that when you are moving from making ethical and moral decisions that are not typical that the general American population has to make, and it isn't. To clarify, it isn't just kicking doors down and the tip of the spear stuff. Matter of fact, most of the time in the military in general, but specifically in special forces, it's not pulling the trigger, but when not to pull the trigger, and what does that look like? And sometimes when you're receiving an order to do something that violates your moral conscience, that causes to challenge your character, that puts you in this state of dilemma. And so the number one super type in the military in general, but also in special forces for moral injury. In the moral injury typology is failure of leadership. And it's not just that they've behaved badly, but sometimes there's bad behavior there's an individual intimidation or organizational intimidation, that comes through. Because you sign up with all the best of intentions, and you train and you get educated and you do battle drills and get yourself ready, and then you're thrown into a situation where you start questioning, is my leader making the best type of decision for not just for me, but also for the team, for this particular mission that's being given.
Sure. Something I want to get back to that you mentioned, Dr. Caterson, was the stigma that's often associated with getting mental health and asking for help. The annual report showed that not the majority, but a large number of folks who had committed suicide within a year or within 90 days of their committing suicide had sought some kind of mental help. They'd been diagnosed with a behavioral emotional problem. They had spent time in an in-treatment facility maybe. So it wasn't a majority, but it was a large number of folks, but they still went through with the act, right? What's the disconnect there, and how do we overcome that?
Yeah, I think that, again, just in the last 4 or 5 years, especially leaning hard the last 2 years, we understanding that there is a big distinction between even moral injury and PTSD. And because, both of them share things like anger, depression, anxiety, self-medication, insomnia, having nightmares, or, that kind of stuff. But you're looking at, there is a distinction between the two. I mean, PTSD is really kind of like a startle reflex. It's a memory loss. It's fear, flashbacks that come, versus moral injuries is more nuanced in sorrow, grief, regret, shame, alienation, and even disgust. And so when we put in simple terms, when we train on this all the time, all throughout our courses, whether it's the pre-command course or in the chaplain courses or in any of our orientation courses or in the advanced one at the Senior Enlisted Academy, is that you're looking at PTSD is really kind of like a traumatic threat to a personal well-being, right? Versus moral injury is a traumatic violation of personal values, right? So, and this is going to nuance itself as you move towards suicidal ideation. PTSD is based on fear and adrenaline, versus moral injury is based on morals and ethics, right? And you're looking at physical or psychological wound for PTSD versus really an invisible or a soul wound. Even some would say a spiritual wound is what moral injury is. And moral injury can be a precursor to suicide, but PTSD can result from moral injury. So in turn, Dr. Thyne, whenever we're training, we'll jump in and look at, sure highlights the research that our team put together on the monograph on moral injury and soft, but it rings true in big military as well, is that whenever you see anger, guilt, and shame, right, and then you add disgust to it, personal disgust, that you got to stop everything, because that is actually, the research has shown that is the accelerator that moves you right into suicide ideation. And the reason is because another advance that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years is that we have to actually change the conversations for them to understand meaning, value, and purpose. So meaning is like, what do I believe? Who do I trust? What do I put my trust into? So there's that belief, and that actually, lights up different parts of the brain. We know from functional MRIs that there is a difference between PTSD and moral injury. So when you're looking at that reptilian brain thing, that animal instinct, type of thing, you kick a dog and the dog's going to go, I don't want to get kicked. I believe that every time I see that foot, I need to move out of the way. And so a belief happens at that level. So at a at a basic level, our belief system or what we put our faith in or what we've trusted, that when that gets violated, that then moves us to that middle section of the brain, which is that a violation of our morals as it relates to what do we value? What it's like our community. Do we belong? So ones believe, the other ones belong. And do I typically belong? And then the higher function of the brain, the neocortex, that we could see light up in the area of when we're tracking moral injury and PTSD, is like, is there a future for me to become? What does my destiny look like? And so when you move to anger, guilt, and shame, and then you add disgust is actually going, there is no preferred future. There is no new normal for me. And then, but the kicker is then it comes back to that middle part of the brain of what you value. Do you belong? So it's like that. There's no reason for me to continue to go on because I'm so disgusted even with myself because I didn't do this or I didn't do that, or the actions that I participated in. And so we're seeing that connection of all that stuff, and in turn, that's going to be helpful. I know that even right now, in looking at a manual approach in psychology, is that they're moving moral injury. I think it will be just a couple of years before it is in the DSM, of being the diagnostic manual of being able to say what does it look like. But I think that this time we're going to see that psychs, chaplains, cognitions are all trying to get on the front end of it instead of being reactionary to it.
Okay. So thank you, because that's a lot of information. I'm just trying to get my brain wrapped around all of it real quickly, right? When we're talking about folks might have sought out help, but because of a lack of knowledge on the front lines for the people needing help, they didn't recognize necessarily that personal disgust was such a huge factor in that. So maybe that's why, even though in 2023, a large number of people did seek out help, but still went on to commit suicide, maybe it's because the knowledge that personal disgust was such a cataclysmic factor wasn't yet part of the institutional knowledge. Is that accurate? Dr. Thyne, I see you nodding a lot.
Yes, when I first heard, I picked this up a year ago from Dr. Caterson and his team, and I latched onto it. I'm not, this is not my area of research, but I latched on it as a leadership principle. When I was in, they used to give us these yellow cards, and it was, how will you know if someone's going to commit suicide? And it had things like they're giving away their valued personal possessions. They seem withdrawn, and so it was a laundry list of things, and they gave it to us for all of us. It was the plastic. It was an actual business card, but it was made out of plastic, and they wanted us to put it in our wallets and to review it from time to time. And so this bright yellow card would frequently appear. It served its purpose, right? Because we would take it out and talk about it and joke about it, but we were using it and we were talking about the principles. So if that part of it we did, but I'm not sure I would really be, what it brought into focus for me was that unless it's someone I work very closely with, meaning each day I am working with this person, I don't really know if there's a dramatic change in their demeanor or a subtle change in their demeanor, or if they're giving away their valued personal possessions. And certainly everyone didn't exhibit all of these traits. So as far as effectively helping me prevent suicide, I'm not sure that it did that for me. So, but I liked the card and I liked the idea behind the card. Now that I'm on the other side of it, and you can see things once you're out of the military that you couldn't see when you were in, no matter how thoughtful or educated you are, we just have some sort of professional and personal blinders on that drop when you get with the benefit of perspective. So when I heard Dr. Caterson and another member of his team briefed this, I thought, this is the word that needs to get out to the force. This is that yellow card. So if you hear people expressing anger, guilt, and shame, drop what you are doing. It's if you hear people expressing anger, guilt, and shame, be a good friend. Listen to them. They're processing and trying to deal with something that is very important to them. So lend an ear. But if you hear people expressing anger, guilt, and shame along with personal disgust, drop what you are doing and go to them immediately, because people tend to resolve feelings of personal disgust by killing themselves. And that's something that I can say as an educator in front of a wide variety of audiences, and that's something concrete that people can latch onto, and they're like, that's something I will recognize. I will recognize people talking about their actions with personal disgust, even if I am transiting the area, and I can do something about that, or I can circle back around to people who know this person. And so, but the other side of that is that organizational change or cultural change takes 10 to 15 years.
Right.
So it's not something, even as trite as it is, even if we put it on bumper stickers and we splattered the Department of Defense with it, it's not something that is going to change our organizational culture in a meaningful way without other partnered initiatives and kind of a widespread focus on it. And so part of this, there's an element of time that we are just going to have to work through. Maybe we can move things along more quickly, but there is going to be some lag in the response chain, no matter how motivated we are and how much we know about the problem.
Years ago there was a show back towards like 2008, 9, 10. Timothy Roth was the star in it, called "Lie to Me," and it focused on micro expressions. And even in the pilot, I went back and was looking at some of them last night, just to make sure that I had it accurately. But even in the pilot, when he's briefing all the FBI, the CIA, they're in this whole room there in DC, and he's showing different micro expressions. But he said that when you see this expression, is the micro expression of personal disgust, he's like, stop right there. That person's about ready to, going to act. They're going to set themselves on fire. They're going to shoot somebody. They're going to go and they're going to move towards actually end their life. So that it's interesting to me that there are people in other disciplines that were seeing this years and years ago, and then we started to key into it. Maybe there's something to this. So I think that it's especially when we're hearing their story and getting them to tell their story, because narrative integration is a real big, huge part of this. Because and we have found in unconventional, non-conventional ways. I mean, typically they're not going to write about it. They're not going to blog about it. They're not going to put in their papers, their after action, any of that stuff. But all of a sudden, you give them the opportunity to draw a picture or to do some kind of activity. And we've seen this over and over and again with the soft moral injury typology, where we're kind of give them the 24 subtypes and the 6 super types, and they're like, looking at it, and they're all of a sudden they will key on one of those things and they might draw a little picture of it. All of a sudden start drawing picture, and you can start picking up like some of the things that are there and that are moving them towards ideation. So the non-conventional ways, we didn't have just the number of reps underneath us in these interviews, in these conversations that we have now. When you've done thousands and thousands, and you've seen thousands of pictures or whiteboards where they've actually drawn out, and you can start picking out, oh, well, that's anger, that's guilt, that's shame. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, well, there's some disgust there. Let's talk a little bit about what are you feeling there? How does this make you feel? What's going on and you can start keying into what's going on internally in their brain is they're going back and forth between there's no becoming and I don't belong anymore, right? And so that's that movement that's going on that that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to piggyback on that and to say, because I've been thinking about how you might follow on with a question, to say, I think it's particularly important that we don't just engage this as a rational problem. We think, oh, we need to provide people this education and this guidance. Because one of the things that has been really interesting that they're doing here at Special Operations Command, and maybe in other commands as well, I just don't know, but they're using virtual reality and those headsets in the suicide prevention training. And I had the opportunity to go through the scenario, and it was, what it did was it generated these emotions in me, and like a physical and an emotional response that you just can't get when you read a scenario and you have a discussion. The closest thing would be if someone who was attempted suicide and then came out on the other end and survived it, and then came and related their story, might be able to push you into that space where you're having an emotional response to somebody's testimony. But I think it's using this modern technology to educate and to push people into the emotions and the physical response, is, I hope, going to ultimately bear fruit as far as giving people an idea of how to respond, and then actually affecting cultural change, and perhaps speeding it up a little bit.
And Dr. Tom, I think you would agree, it's somewhat of a game changer, even for the caregiver or those that are trying to provide care in the area of moral injury or suicide. Just a month ago, in one of our advanced courses that we had special force chaplains, but psychs in the room, cognitions in the room, going through it, and for them to experience this as well. Those that are going to try and provide care, for them to go through the scenarios, and it's 360. So, I mean, you turn your chair around, and because of the technology, you can look at every area of the room and then come back focus. So, I think for them to experience what the soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Guardian are gonna go through as they use the headsets, is very, very powerful, because they're gonna and we know what we want to move it towards, even that family members would be able to experience this as well, because it puts you in a scenario where you're right there and you're very present with what they're dealing with, and we have seen, at least with the service member, that they have said, "Wow, like I was right back there," and that's the goal of it.
I want to just get some clarification on the virtual reality training there. So is it a situation where it's back to the original situation which created the moral injury, or
No.
what's the training?
It's you're faced with you're walking into somebody's personal space, apartment, dorm room, whatever it is,
Okay.
and they're talking with this anger, guilt, and shame and personal disgust, and then at the bottom, it will pop up
the response kind of thing.
Choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Gotcha.
And you look at it and think, well, I wouldn't do any of these things. What's another response? And you're forced to pick the closest response to what you would do, and you really start to feel this. So now it's compounded, right? Because you're starting to feel this pressure that if you choose the wrong thing, you're going to push this person to do something. And you're aware you're wearing a headset. You're aware this guy is in your headset, but it's just superb as far as it is orders of magnitude better than reading a scenario and discussing it, even if you're trying to make that effective.
We've seen across the military that this virtual training is impactful whenever it's used. So right. If it's used in this sort of situation, I'm sure that the technology and the software is built to be impactful. On that note, which kind of leads me into my next, and we were talking about the institutionalized knowledge, and 10 to 15 years before we see that cultural change. 92% of the suicides happened in the States, where conceivably these service folks have the most resources available to them. Conceivably, they're at home, they're in their home country. So conceivably, it's the most at peace that these people might ever be because they're, not deployed. But 92% of the suicides are happening here. Is that just a factor of statistically most service members spend most of their time in the States? Or, what is there anything to glean from that statistic or not?
Well, I don't know, and I can't speak with any expertise, but my off-the-cuff answer to that, having served 2 back-to-back overseas assignments, and then I had a stateside assignment, which was a fairly remote assignment, is that there is a sense of community when you're overseas as Americans, and when you're in a more remote part of the United States without all the big city and the entertainment and the support and all that stuff that draws people together. And you really have that support from that larger family and that support from a community, that when you're stateside in a very built up, robust area, and there are all sorts of entertainment options, and everybody is basically coming together at work, but doing their own thing with their families and on their own in the evenings and on the weekends, there isn't that same sense of support and community. And certainly once you retire and move into the civilian community, there's even less of it. So I think when people are overseas, or if they're in an area where there is that leadership that provides that sense of family and community and support, people are drawn to that, and they derive benefits from it that they may not recognize.
Do that. Last question I have. It seems like a lot of the progress that's been, when we're talking about the virtual training that SOCOM is using, that's expensive, right? Funding for fiscal year 2024 was $17.8 million. Fiscal year 25, it's requested up to $547 million, which would be a huge windfall for suicide prevention in the military. Is more funding, are all the answers more funding, or is more funding, yes, that's going to help, but we also need to use that funding for XYZ purposes?
Doc, what do you think?
Well, I think when you don't know what to do, you throw, if you can, you throw more money at the problem so that those people who are ideators can come forward with their good ideas and bring them through fruition. And the idea would be there might be something out there that will work. I always come back to, this is not a new problem. You can go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey and other epic tales like that, where you send off your warriors and then you have a reintegration problem. So this is not a simple problem. It's not even a complicated problem. It's a complex problem.
Right.
And so we're at this point, when we throw money at something, we are looking for solutions in that complexity. Is how I see it. Is we are throwing money at the problem so that we can search for solutions in the complexity, with research, with education and training and counseling, and bringing and drawing more people into the process, because this is a problem that we all have to solve together. We can't just outsource it. It's an interdisciplinary problem, not just a single discipline problem. The psychs or the chaplains, or the counselors, or whomever, the supporting agencies. It is a problem that is multifaceted and is going to require an interdisciplinary solution. So more money brings more people to the table.
Yeah, and I think that Dr. Thyne would actually agree as well, is that we like to call something, you call it the pre-pre, right? To like what used to be just typically when you would go into the military, World War I, World War II, even up to Vietnam, is there were certain part of your training and your education that helps you understand meaning, value, and purpose. And what does that look like? And I think that we got away from it because there were other things that we thought that are a priority, need to be our priority. And so we're getting back to, if we can get it on the front end, that when they're coming through, basic training, and when they're coming into the soft community, what does it look like that they're getting ethics training, moral training, even, looking at spiritual, psychological, and cognitive, that they work together, because they can work together. They should work together, because even based on that, whether it's comprehensive military fitness, comprehensive soldier fitness, or in the world that Kari and I live in, it's preservation of force and family, that looks at you holistically, that you are a cognitive being, you're a psychological being, you are a social family being, you are a physical being, but you're also a spiritual being. So how they all work together, if we can get on the front end of doing ethics and moral and that kind of holistic training, to understand meaning, value, and purpose, and have that consistent, that would be prevention at its best form. That if we were actually instilling that very, very early on, instead of all of a sudden now we have intervention and now we have postvention, it's like, how do we put that back on the front? And so there's lots of organizations that are out there that are partnering with the VA, partnering with the DoD. I think of one like Stop Soldier Suicide that is saying, we have to be addressing core issues that we didn't address before. Is like, how does this service member, how do they believe? How do they belong? How are they seeing that becoming is a reality for them all the time? That tomorrow could be better than today, and giving that hope for it. So I think that we talk about as a we got to start putting this back into it, because they go through all kinds of training and qualifications. But what about ethics? What about moral training? What about spiritual, psychological, and cognitive training that all work together in a holistic way that actually gets on the front end of it instead of being reactionary? Because if they're going to, we just did a training where there's an emphasis on battle drills. So if you jump out of a plane, your parachute doesn't open, these three things you do right immediately. You're pulling out on the risers, you're making sure that you're turning your body and twisting. And if all that doesn't work, you cut away your main chute and you put on your backup chute. You drill that over and over and over again. Or if your gun jams, exactly, you drop it, you put it back in, hit the safety, see if it works, right? We drill that kind of stuff. Well, we need to drill the same type of stuff on, do we understand that, these things like ethics and morals and spiritual, psychological, and cognitive all work together, and we train on those. So if we get on the front end of it, and I think that's where the dollars are going to go. I think that dollars are not going to be spent unless they understand this. Really, it's kind of a narrative model. It's like it's helping them get in touch with their story of who they are before and as they're in it, and then afterwards, it's different because they have lived this.
Yeah, Dr. Thyne.
For your own preparation, I think it would be, if you've not read about The Theater of War by Brian Dories, there's articles out there, and then he wrote a book called Theater of War, Brian Dories, based on these reintegration experiences in ancient times that resonate in present day. So the work he is doing, I think, is very important. And then Karl Marlante's book, What It Is Like to Go to War, he talks about the paradox and how we got to this position to where if you tell the young men who you are asking to go out and do X, Y, and Z on behalf of the nation, what happens to the human being when they do X, Y, and Z, and what they are going to have to confront, and what the rest of their life may look like, to include suicidal ideation, who's going to sign up for that? Yeah. We're an all-volunteer force, right? So he says that's the paradox, but that's in fact what is required, is what Dr. Caterson is talking about, that education, that getting on the front end of it, the pre. And so we're planting seeds now that will take, a decade or more to come to fruition. Nevertheless, putting it on and saying, well, that's going to take too long. Well, the longer we wait to do it, it's going to take even longer. So that's the pre is getting on the front end of this.
That's a good point. Yeah. If I come from an agricultural background, so, if you want to get a crop, like, you got to plant, and the longer you wait to plant, the longer it's going to take to harvest, so. Dr. Thyne, Dr. Caterson, thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add to the conversation? A question I didn't ask you feel like needs to be answered?
No, you've done a great job. But just so that there's a preview, we're hoping by next summer, two of the works that we're involved in. One is called The Invisible Enemy, will come out, which looks at a moral injury typology and treatment as it looks at everything we've been talking about today, the continuum of looking at ethics training, moral training that moves into addressing head-on moral injury, PTSD, and suicide ideation, all that stuff. And the other one is that we're trying to get finished up is the invisibility cloak, which is the work that Dr. Thyne has pioneered, that gives that pre emphasis as well, because we even the titles of both of those, Invisible Enemy, Invisibility Cloak, they are intriguing, and we do think that they will be useful for the team of developing the pre.
You bet.
I'm glad to have met you and your and your writer, Brent. I'm glad that you guys are working in this space, and I admire you for being part of the conversation and for bringing this to the forefront of other people who we need everybody, or as many people. We need a coalition of the willing to take on this problem, and I do think it is a problem that we can, if not solve, we can at least be a lot better at it.
That's right.
You bet.